Sorry.
My sincere apologies. There are so many issues in the gracious speech that I would like to tackle. I'd like to talk about nuclear safeguards, about agriculture and fisheries, about the folly of HS2. However, I'm going to try to contain my enthusiasm or my fury and talk about only 2 or possibly 3 issues. First, I'd like to speak on counter-terrorism. Now, I would actually welcome any legislation being brought forward that keeps the police and the security services focused on the real problem of terrorism and serious crime, rather than they're wasting time and our money monitoring Green campaigners, anti-fracking protesters, journalists and elected politicians. The government's manifesto said they will consider what new offences or aggravated offences that might be needed. But I would recommend to your Lordship's House that we block any legislation that doesn't include a clear definition of what an extremist is. Some noble lords may be aware that I was on the domestic extremist database for more than 10 years. At the time, I was an elected politician. I was on the oversight body for the Met Police Authority. I was successfully working with the police on all sorts of issues, including road crime, FGM, and protecting their wildlife crime unit. The wildlife crime unit is about things like imports of exotic, threatened, endangered species rather than naughty squirrels, just to be clear. Now, it's likely that my personal emails were hacked by police officers, and the Independent Police Complaints Commission is currently investigating the reasons for the hasty destruction of my file and the evidence of any hacking that it might have contained. A file destroyed despite the Met Commissioners specifically ordering that such files should not be deleted. Now, there's also a proposal for a commission on extremism. Now, the independent reviewer of terrorism, Max Hill QC, has said we do not need new laws to tackle the current terrorist threat. We need to use the laws we have and resource the agencies responsible for upholding them. And yet, despite this, the government appears to be keen to legislate. And not for terrorism, but for what it calls non-violent extremism. So the new statutory commission for countering extremism will identify examples of extremism and expose them. The simple fact is, it's impossible at the moment to agree a definition of what constitutes an extremist. A terrorist, yes. An extremist, no. One person's non-violent extremist is another person's political hero. We have to be very, very careful with these terms. The Met Police currently uses a very clear definition of a domestic extremist, which restricts it to those involved in terrorism or serious crime. But they regard this as guidance only, which means they can use it or not use it as they please. And of course, they please to use it on people like me. In the past, the police have wasted huge amounts of their time on monitoring Greenpeace campaigners or people like me, and one can imagine all sorts of people being labelled extreme, especially in the current political climate. Why should I be a domestic extremist, not the DUP? I would argue that I threaten fewer values fewer of our national values than they do. And we especially do not want our own distinctively British brand of McCarthyism. I think that's incredibly important. The second issue that I want to tackle is climate change, and particularly in view of Brexit. I think everyone will agree that the gracious speech was rather light on any reference to the environment. It was in there. It came just before, it came right at the end, just before the mention of the royal visit of the King and Queen of Spain. So it was in there. But it is, in fact, the greatest global threat that we face. And I really feel it deserves a little bit more prominence in our government's thinking. We need an Environmental Protection Act. Such an act would cut through all the political ideology of left and right that often sidelines the environment, and it would be an evidence-based, long-term approach to the problem, and it would infiltrate every single aspect, so that when we talk about economics, we talk about business, we would be thinking about the environment at the same time. And crucially, it would have to be via primary legislation, so that which would guarantee a proper level of parliamentary scrutiny and oversight. We also need a Clean Air Act. It's obvious at the moment we have a huge national health problem, and public health problem with dirty air, especially in our urban centres, and it's time that we dealt with it. A lot of the legislation around the environment does need primary legislation, including, for example, an independent agency that, for example, would be similar to the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. We need to take climate change seriously, and if we don't, it's the worse for all of us.